Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another of the What Would You Say videos, this one on the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this video doesn't actually cover anything terribly groundbreaking, I mean, really do any of them, but I started watching it just in case, and partway through, I was startled by a surprise Wallace. Well, I know I'm not going to get anything new out of this, but it is a moment where two apologetics worlds are colliding, so I couldn't resist. So here we are. Let's go!
You're in a conversation and someone says, Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, the resurrection story was faked.
Okay, I know me making this point this early in the video will kind of undermine the whole rest of the video, but I'm gonna do it anyway. I don't know of anyone who thinks that the resurrection was faked. Okay, I lied. There is a fringe group who think that Jesus was invented by the Roman government as a propaganda tactic in an attempt to split Judaism during the Jewish wars around 70 CE, but that is a fringe position even among mythicists who already hold a fringe position, so this is one that's a fringe of a fringe. So anyway, the word faked implies intention. It is likely that the incorrect elements of the Jesus story, like the resurrection, empty tomb, miracle stories, appearances, etc., were exaggerations potentially based on a kernel of truth. But at no point does there have to be an intent to exaggerate the story in order for the story to become exaggerated. So faked is not the right word to use.
In the modern era of science and technology, ancient claims involving supernatural, miraculous events can seem a lot more like mythology than history.
Right. So when we see a supernatural claim recorded in an ostensibly historical document, how should we evaluate that? Well, we evaluate that in the same way we would evaluate any historical claim. We try to figure out the most likely scenario given the data that we currently have access to. And when looking at probabilities, it is universally more likely that an author was wrong about a supernatural claim than that the supernatural claim is true. No natural explanation need be fabricated to counter the supernatural claim in order to reach this conclusion. It is simply a matter of probability. Of course, this does nothing to disprove such claims, but it does explain why historical accounts alone are insufficient when it comes to proving miraculous claims.
When an author from antiquity writes about a miraculous experience or observation, we usually assume they're naive, mistaken, delusional, or lying.
Or are faithfully retelling accounts that came to them from people who were naive, mistaken, delusional, or lying, sometimes with unintentional exaggerations of their own. And in the case of the Bible, where we have no reliable records about anyone making any sorts of claims, except for Paul, who describes his claim in a way that is consistent with hallucination, we don't even have decent records from a trusted source. We have anonymous hearsay.
Many ancient biblical authors seem to see and experience the risen Jesus.
There is only one biblical author who claims to have himself experienced the risen Jesus. That's Paul. All the rest are either pretending to be someone they are not, as in the books of 1st and 2nd Peter, or are authored anonymously, as in the Gospels.
And it's difficult to explain these varied group experiences as simultaneous delusions or coincidental errors.
They don't need to be. If you look at Paul's writings outside of the context of the Gospels, since the Gospels didn't exist when he was writing, then it's not hard to realize that the details surrounding Jesus' life are incredibly sparse, including his death and resurrection. All we can get from Paul's writings is that Jesus was crucified and that Paul had some sort of experience with him which he described as being a revelation that came from no man. Now, certainly this doesn't conclusively rule out the resurrection, but it is also consistent with hallucination, and so the honest historian is left with Paul having had a hallucination of some kind as being the more probable scenario.
Maybe that's why so many skeptics think the disciples of Jesus were simply lying, telling a fake story about the resurrection.
I don't know anyone who thinks they were lying. I know of some who think they didn't exist, and I know of some who think that the ones that we actually have historical records for were honestly mistaken, but even among the people who think that Christianity started as Roman propaganda, I don't think they would say the disciples were lying. There are many paths for a story to becoming exaggerated beyond believability that don't involve anyone telling a lie.
But if there's one thing I've learned as a homicide detective,
it's that Christians are desperate for authorities to tell them that their religion is correct, and so you can make a lot of money harping on your credentials in order to make them feel better. Oh, wait, that's probably not what he was going to say.
conspiracies of this nature, if they are to be successful, rely on key characteristics and conditions, and none of these critical attributes were present for the disciples of Jesus.
Well, hypothetically granting that the only options here are either a conspiracy of liars or that Jesus actually rose from the grave, I'm curious how you would know the specific circumstances surrounding the original events if the stories were originally based on lies, given that several decades passed in between the events happening and the records of the events being written down.
So the next time someone says, the story of Jesus' resurrection was faked, here are 3 things to remember. Number 1, the story involved too many people and too much time to be faked.
Interesting. Are you saying that it would be more likely to be fake if the Gospels were actually written during the life of Jesus than if they were written after decades of the stories being spread purely orally? That seems counterintuitive. I hope you explain how that is supposed to work. Spoiler, he doesn't.
Successful conspiracies require the smallest possible number of co-conspirators circulating the lie for the shortest period of time.
That depends on the goal of the conspiracy, I suppose. If you're a traveling salesman looking to grift some marks, you may need 1 or 2 people to be in on it with you in order to make it more successful, and you'd want to be out of that location when the truth of your grift is exposed. But if you're trying to set up a long con where people will continue to support you financially for potentially many years, then yeah, you'd still want to keep the number of people in the know as small as possible, but you'd want to design the grift in such a way that it will withstand scrutiny and have built-in excuses for potential objections. So, for instance, if you're looking to start a religion, it might be helpful to include a bit about how everyone really believes in that religion deep down, but those who say they don't are just denying the truth, because they just don't want to believe. They just want to sin or live in unrighteousness or whatever. Just as an example. Nobody would be that blatant about it, would they?
It's a lot easier for 2 people to tell a lie and keep a secret than it is for 20 to.
Yes, but if those 2 people tell that lie and you now have 20 more who believe that lie, you have 20 honest believers out there spreading the message without lying, resulting from the initial 2 lying non-believers who were just pretending. So again, depending on your goals for telling that lie, this might be preferable.
It's also a lot easier to tell a lie and keep a secret for a day than it is for a year.
Yes, but that doesn't stop people from trying. Would you say that Joseph Smith was telling the truth simply because he continued with his blatant lies for years, being so convincing with them that they outlived him by more than a century and counting? If you would, you'd be a Mormon.
There were simply too many eyewitnesses of the risen Christ. Luke identifies 120 in Acts.
Well, let's look at Acts 1:16 in context. I'm pretty sure he actually means 1:15 because that's where the 120 number is given. In those days, Peter stood up among the brothers, the company of persons was in all about 120, and said, yada yada, this is where Judas gets replaced with Matthias with the roll of the dice, because apparently there have to be 12 disciples for some reason. You can't have 11. But the reason it came down to a roll of the dice is because they were looking for men who had been with Jesus from his baptism until his resurrection, which resulted in 2 men being put forward as meeting those qualifications, with the correct one being decided on by casting lots, because that's a reliable way to make important decisions, I guess. So, to me, this leaves us with 2 for sure who are being claimed as witnesses, maybe more, but that isn't really specified. But now let's look at who is writing this. Supposedly, this is the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. The author of Luke flat out states that he was not an eyewitness, but is compiling accounts that he has heard from other sources, which he doesn't bother to cite. So it is an anonymously authored account of unsourced events, and even if I grant that the 120 people mentioned here were all supposed to have been witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, it doesn't come from a reliable enough source for us to actually determine that Peter even gave a speech to these 120 people, much less that these 120 people even existed in the first place.
And Paul identifies over 500 in 1 Corinthians.
Identifies is a really strong word to use there. Mentions would be more appropriate. None of the 500 were identified. On top of this, As apologists are fond of pointing out, the statement that Paul made that claims there were 500 witnesses shows evidence of being a creedal statement of early Christian beliefs, which means that it was not original to Paul. So for this one, we have a known author quoting an anonymous source about unverifiable events involving mostly unnamed people. So, remember when you said that if you want to lie about something like that, you'd want the people who are in on the lie to be small in number? So far, we've only got 2 people who need to be in on the lie in order for it to be a lie: the author of Acts and whoever originally composed the creed that Paul was reciting. Now, for all we know, whoever composed the creed that Paul copied was also the source of the tradition for how Judas was replaced with Matthias that the author of Acts was relaying. So it's even possible that we only have one liar in this whole scenario, and this one liar is responsible for the lie that duped both the author of Acts and Paul. In this scenario, neither Paul nor the author of Acts are the liars. They could both honestly believe it, but were tricked by an earlier liar or two, as both of them are reporting on events that they are aware of, but were not witnesses to themselves, except for Paul's line about Jesus appearing to him last, in a manner that leaves plenty of room open for it being a hallucinatory experience.
In addition, these witnesses faithfully communicated what they saw for nearly 60 years without flinching or changing their story. If the story of Jesus was faked, it would have been exposed easily given the number of people making the claims for nearly 6 decades.
Do you have evidence to suggest that the people making the claims were doing so in a way that would make them easy to verify? Do you have evidence to suggest that such a claim couldn't last for 6 decades unless it was true? You know, acupuncture doesn't work, and has been verified repeatedly that it does not work when it's studied scientifically, and yet the idea that acupuncture is good for treating all sorts of diseases and maladies has persisted for longer than 6 decades. Misinformation actually spreads easier than the information that corrects it, and is often quite persistent, especially if there are religious qualities to the misinformation.
Number 2. The relationships of the disciples were too distant for this story to be faked.
The disciples who completely disappear from reliable history after the Jesus story? Those guys? The ones for which the most detailed account of any post-Jesus life they may have had comes from the book of Acts, which doesn't tell us where it got the information from? And Acts doesn't really tell us what the disciples were up to once Saul enters the picture, except for Peter. Now, sorry, I should probably specify here, it doesn't tell us what the 12 were up to once Saul enters the picture. This is one of the books that is less specific than I would like with how it uses the word disciple.
Successful conspiracies require excellent communication. Everyone participating in the conspiracy needs to tell the same story, and that's hard to do unless they can communicate regularly.
And given the significant differences in the stories being told, there is no evidence that they got their story straight, except for the parts where the story is blatantly plagiarized, of course. Hell, even the story of Paul's conversion isn't kept straight through a single book. Acts 9 states that Paul's companions heard the voice but saw no one, while Acts 22 states that they saw a light but did not hear a voice. If one single author can't even keep a story straight in his own book, why should we trust his claim of 120 witnesses even if we interpret that 120 number as all being witnesses?
That's why as detectives, the first thing we do when interviewing multiple suspects is separate them.
So what you're saying is that the Gospels are not reliable because they clearly were not separated given how much plagiarism took place? Because another thing you have to do is look at where the accounts are different and compare that to where they are the same. The Gospels were written with different audiences in mind, and the changes that are made reflect that. The story changes to be more palatable for the people who are expected to be reading it, but when no change is needed, they are word-for-word copies of each other. Well, the synoptics at least. John is just, well, John.
Successful conspiracies also benefit from strong familial relationships.
They can, yeah, but they don't necessarily.
Conspirators are far less likely to rat out fellow family members. The disciples didn't have the benefit of excellent communication or overarching family relationships.
And it shows. Paul spends a lot of time arguing about how other people teaching in the churches are false messengers, sometimes even calling out people who were supposedly with Jesus through his whole ministry and were eyewitnesses to the resurrection. There's a lot of, no, don't listen to those guys, we're the ones with the right message going on in the Bible. So clearly there were multiple different messages making different and conflicting claims being spread in much the same way as Paul's message was. So how do we know that Paul's message was actually the right one? We don't. It's just the one that became the most popular, possibly because he didn't require people to cut off parts of their penises in order to join the commune. Just imagine that. The most popular version of what is now the most popular religion on the planet might have only gained its popularity because it was the version that didn't require painful surgery before anesthetic was invented. The fact that this is the version that won is less impressive now, isn't it? Now, to be fair, I don't know if that's actually the reason why it won, but that is how it looks to me.
The 12 apostles, for example, were separated by thousands of miles without the ability to communicate with each other.
And with the exception of Peter, they all disappeared at that point. For all we know, they just went back to their homes in Galilee and did nothing remarkable with the rest of their lives. Sure, that's not the church tradition, but the church tradition had its origin in documents that the church doesn't generally consider to be trustworthy, so I'm unsure why we should trust these documents for some of the details of the lives of the 12, but not others.
They couldn't coordinate lies, quote unquote, or disprove a false claim that one of them might have recanted in a faraway land.
And there's no evidence that they ever even tried to coordinate anything, lies or truths. What were they teaching in these faraway lands? We don't even know if they went to these faraway lands in the first place, much less what they taught there. Though we certainly do have Paul writing letters to churches in faraway lands telling them not to listen to anyone but him, indicating that the things being taught in these faraway lands were different, and, if Paul is to be believed, not true.
While a few of the apostles were related, most were not. And Matthew, the writer of one of the earliest Gospels, wasn't even liked by the other disciples when he first joined the group.
It's cute that you think the book of Matthew was written by Matthew the disciple. But you're outside of the consensus on this one, even among Christian scholars. But what's more interesting here is that you acknowledge elsewhere that Mark is not an eyewitness account. You think that Mark was writing down the teachings of Peter when Peter was teaching in Rome.
Mark is writing down Peter's teaching in Rome, and Peter doesn't always teach in chronological order. Peter taught in themes.
Why, then, would Matthew copy, word for word, more than 90% of Mark to use in his story? Why would an eyewitness copy a non-eyewitness's account when writing down his eyewitness account? That doesn't make any sense. So Matthew was not an eyewitness and was copying from another non-eyewitness, who you claim got his account from Peter, who would have been an eyewitness. But Mark doesn't actually say where he got the story. The most likely scenario is that it's just a compilation of oral stories that were in circulation at the time.
If the story of Jesus was faked, it would have been easily exposed given the geographic and relational distance of the disciples.
But didn't you just say that they were telling the truth because of how far apart they are and how it would be hard for them to coordinate their stories because of that distance? How does that translate into these people in these faraway places could easily have tried to verify these stories and would have easily been able to prove them wrong and spread the fact that they are wrong across these distances that the disciples couldn't possibly have communicated over?
Number 3. The motives of the disciples were too weak for the story to be faked.
Even if I grant everything you've said up until now, how do we even know what their motives were? Can we be certain that they would have written down their nefarious intentions for us to find centuries later?
Successful conspiracies are motivated conspiracies. Detectives learn quickly that there are only 3 reasons why anyone tells a lie: financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power.
Any detective who thinks that those are the only 3 reasons anyone ever tells a lie is a garbage detective. To save yourself embarrassment, to protect people from harm, and to avoid inconvenience are 3 more reasons that I can think of with little to no effort. If you slip on ice and fall, you might claim that you meant to do that because you knew someone would be watching and you wanted to make them laugh. People lie to detectives all the time to protect people that they care about from getting into trouble. And if I'm supposed to get something done in a certain time frame and it's close to the deadline and someone asks if I've done it yet, I might say yes to avoid the confrontation, while still intending to finish the task within that time frame. I'm sure there are many, many more reasons why people might tell lies without falling into those 3 categories, but I think this suffices for just showing that those aren't the only 3 categories.
If the alleged eyewitnesses of the resurrection, all 500 plus of them, were lying, What was their motivation?
Do we even have a reason to believe that the 500 witnesses ever existed in the first place? The source for that is Paul repeating a creed that he learned from an anonymous source, and whose composition is anonymous. No names of the 500 are given, nobody had any way to check their stories, nobody even knows what their stories were if they existed. Even if they existed, maybe those 500 people spread throughout the world, all telling different stories of their encounter, which left Paul with a mess of different theologies that he felt the need to counter with his version of the theology. Can you say with any certainty that that's not what happened? No, you can't. At least not with any more certainty than you can say that all their stories lined up.
None of them got rich from the lie. None collected girlfriends, and none even had the power to prevent their own martyrdom.
So, which of the 500 witnesses was martyred? What is your source for that? Do you know that none of them used their story to get girlfriends? Given the rumors of sex cult versions of Christianity that were countered by the early church fathers, it seems that at least some of the people were using Christianity for sex in the early days. Did none of them get financially rewarded? And actually, for that one, let's look at a more modern example. Wallace has an article on his website about how these motives for lying apply to Mormonism. For the financial greed section, he says, "As the prophet of the new religious system, Smith relied largely on the support of his followers. Smith repeatedly sought financial support of members of the church who worked in one manner or another. Over the years while Smith lived with the group, hundreds of members contributed to projects initiated by Joseph, and Smith's writings include divine commandments for the prophet to be sustained by his people." Well, let's look at the Bible. 1 Corinthians 9:13-14 says, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." Philippians 4:16-19 plants the seeds of the prosperity gospel by pointing out that if you send me a bunch of nice stuff, God will supply all of your needs. 1 Timothy 5:17-18 instructs you to pay church leaders who rule well double wages. So, looks like there are plenty of divine commands for increasing the material wealth of the preachers and church leaders in the New Testament. And are you telling me that all the people writing these letters to the churches, exerting their influence to enforce certain behaviors, were not increasing in power over their congregations? If we take the book of Acts at face value, Peter defies the very same Jewish council that managed to get Jesus crucified, and his power over them was such that they ended up leaving him and the new community of Christians alone. How is that not power?
Instead, the early eyewitnesses of the resurrection only suffered for their claims.
Not according to the Bible.
Most were martyred. Many were persecuted. Others were ostracized.
According to extra-biblical sources that you don't trust for any other information, most of which were written centuries after the fact.
Yet they held to their claims with unwavering determination, all without any motive to lie.
They were claimed to have held to their claims with unwavering determination, with at least 2 of your 3 motives for lying.
If the story of Jesus was faked, it would have been exposed easily once the pressure was applied against a group that had little or nothing to gain.
By that point, the people who originated the lie don't have to be involved with the lie anymore. The cause had been taken up by true believers who were taken in by the lie, and so were convinced that the lie was true. And, of course, this is all just hypothetically granting that it started with a lie. What seems more likely to me is that it started with stories that grew from personal experiences, possibly hallucinations or dreams, that wouldn't have needed very many people to start spreading them in order for them to grow into the movement that it did. I'm partial to Paul Agea's explanation that all of Christianity could have had its basis in 2 hallucinations, a post-bereavement hallucination for Peter, and a possible psychotic break hallucination for Paul as a result of feeling guilty for causing so much harm to that particular group. It doesn't have to have started this way. There could have been more hallucinations involved, but if we start with the assumption that Jesus was a real guy who was crucified by the Romans, a mere 2 hallucinations is sufficient to explain the entire rise of Christianity. At no point would anyone have had to lie about it. The story just grows as it's retold, as stories often do. But even if we assume that it started with a lie, by the time the persecutions are happening, the liar who started it all might well have cashed out, taken the stuff that was given to him by the believers who were being told to pay the preachers for their preaching, and been long gone. The fact that all of the eyewitness testimony stories come from unknown sources means that we have no way of determining how the person who originated those stories ended their life, because we just don't even know who they were.
So the next time you're sharing the truth of Christianity and someone says, Jesus wasn't actually resurrected from the dead, that story was faked, remember these three things.
And then pray to God that the person who said that doesn't have any critical thinking skills, because it doesn't take much to show that these three things just don't actually prove anything. I agree that the stories being entirely made up from scratch is not the most likely scenario, but it is way more likely than the stories actually being true. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Jacob, who said, "This channel is cringe. Rhino argues with TV screens why he doesn't think there is a God and wins." Well, I agree that my channel's cringe. I specialize in cringe. Just ask my kids sometimes about my sense of humor. But the arguing with TV screens thing isn't why I'm cringe. That's just me countering apologetic arguments the way they present them. I am working on continuing my series where I talk about the various apologetic arguments for God without it being a response video, but the thing that makes that hard to do is that I now have to rely on myself to accurately present the apologetic argument, which, given my low opinion of the arguments, increases the likelihood that I will be presenting a straw man, even if unintentionally. Response videos make sure that I am responding to the argument as presented by a person who actually believes it to be a good argument. So, if you think I win with that method, then what does that say about the arguments that I'm winning against? Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the anonymous sources that back up the claim that is my channel. If you'd like to obviously have been telling the truth because anyone can check on you when they don't even know who you are, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, or listen to my podcast with my daughter, the links for those are also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!